This is the first episode in Season 2 of the Apologetics Guy Show. Whether you've been with us from the beginning or this is your very first time joining us, thank you. Thank you so much for making this podcast a part of your apologetics training. Welcome to the Apologetics Guy Show. It's the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about God, Jesus, and the Bible, and then helps you to be able to better explain your faith with both courage and compassion. If we're just meeting, I'm Dr. Mikel Del Rosario. I'm the host of this podcast, and I'm also a professor of Bible and theology at the Moody Bible Institute here in downtown Chicago. And I want to welcome you to my independent show. Well, how can we investigate Christianity like an actual detective? What strategies can we learn from police investigations that can help us be better case makers for the Christian message in a very skeptical world? That is what this episode is all about. And it's fitting that my guest on the show coming to us via Zoom is Jim Wallace. Jim was actually the first guest I had on when we started the show. He is the cold case homicide detective who you might have seen on Dateline or the movie God's Not Dead 2. And he's the author of a number of popular apologetics books. And his latest one is actually an update of the very first book, Cold Case Christianity. It is totally refreshed for the 10-year anniversary. Welcome back to the show, Jim.
Well, I actually didn't realize that I was the first, so I'm really privileged to be the first and to be back with you at the beginning of this season. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I got to see the pre-pub version of the book, and I love all the new content, love the redesign, and especially I really like all the new illustrations. And I don't know if people know this, but you actually drew all of those yourself, right?
Well, yeah, and I'm glad to hear you say that because I kind of wondered, it made the impact that we were hoping it would make, and you kind of hate to mess with something that's already working, right? Like, why, if it's not broken, why fix it? But I really wanted to have this be a completely illustrated book where there wasn't a page you would turn without a graphic element. And at that point in my career as a writer, I also think they trusted me with it. So we wrote the book. It had about 90 illustrations in it. Now it's got 390 illustrations. Some things you kind of have to see them, especially when you're doing cumulative case apologetics or cumulative case defense of the Gospels. That's really about the body, the cumulative body of evidence. And of course, when you're in front of juries, this is what we would do in front of juries. We would create this visual to show you, wow, that's a lot of evidence. And that's what we're trying to do in this book.
Yeah. Well, Jim, when I first started doing apologetics, I had Christians who would actually tell me, you shouldn't do apologetics. Apologetics doesn't work. No one comes to faith in Christ through apologetics. I always like to think about your story as one example of how some people actually, not everybody, but some people do actually say that God used apologetics in their lives, in their spiritual journey. And so I want to kind of begin with your story, because you used to be the kind of atheist who made some Christians a little nervous to be around. So how does an atheist detective get interested in the Bible, one, and then two, believe that the Christian message is actually true, and then decide to follow Jesus? Give us a step-by-step on how that happened for you.
I hear the same thing. I mean, I hear this all the time that you should. Now, I would always say, look, the gospel is the power of God. It is. The gospel is all the power. But there were times, there are lots of folks in your world probably who wouldn't listen to the gospel. They built this construct of walls in front of it. They don't hear it. You're proclaiming the gospel. It's just bouncing off like Teflon. And it's largely because they've got some of their worldview in mind that prevents them from hearing the gospel clearly. That was my case. The only Christians I knew were police officers. I was about 35 when I got interested in this. And I was working as a detective, and lots of the officers I knew and the detectives I knew, there weren't very many Christians in our department, and they didn't seem to be able to defend what they believed anyway. And the Christians I met more often than officers were the people I was taking to jail, and they sure didn't live like they were Christians. So I was just not interested. I kind of followed in my dad's footsteps. My dad's not a believer. Although he would say, if you want to believe, great, good for you. He thinks it's a very useful delusion. He'd be happy to go as an atheist with his wife to whatever religious service she wants to attend. My parents aren't married. They divorced when I was 3, but his second wife is a Mormon, and he doesn't believe that's true. But he's more than happy to entertain the delusion for his children because he thinks it's a useful delusion. And that was really my view as well. If Susie wants to go to church, and she wasn't a Christian at the time, but I think she was far more interested than I was. And so if she wants to go, I can go as an atheist. My dad's been doing that his entire life. So off I went, and I went to a church that pitched Jesus in a way I could catch him. The pastor was a very much interested in what non-believers in the room might be thinking, And he said that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived.
Hmm.
And that was good enough for me to get interested in buying a Bible. So I bought one, and to see what was in this that was so interesting or so smart. He said he was so smart. Well, let's see what's so smart about Jesus. I was only interested in the red letters. And as I read through them, I realized that there were some things that are worth chasing here, because unlike for example, I had a sociology teacher in high school. Great guy, loved him, one of my favorite teachers, and he was a Baha'i. And so he brought me the writings of Baha'u'llah, and he said, you should read these, Jim. These are really, really fascinating, really true. And there's no way to test the writing of Baha'u'llah, because they're just proverbial wise wisdom statements. It's like trying to test fortune cookies. How do you test those? But the claims of Jesus and the claims of the gospel authors in the New Testament are very different, because they're rooted in time and history. They're making claims about a specific set of events that allegedly occurred at a specific time in history in a specific region of the world. And these are claims we can then test. And so that's why I got interested in testing them like eyewitness accounts.
Yeah, I think for Christians who say that apologetics doesn't work, I think they just don't know anybody who happens to have found that God used the evidence in their lives as part of their spiritual journey. So I think their sample size is just a little too small. Or maybe their definition of what apologetics is a little too narrow, because for some people they think apologetics is only talking about philosophy or only talking about syllogisms, and apologetics is way more than just that. So I love the kind of evidential approach that you take. It's not something that just relies on deductive kinds of arguments. You make use of all kinds of evidence. So tell us about how you use the rules of evidence from your detective work to actually make the case for Christianity when you train Christians to share their faith and get into spiritual conversations with others.
I think that you're absolutely right. That when I became a Christian, I thought, well, doesn't everyone become a Christian this way? Doesn't everyone look at the case and decide if this is evidentially true or not before they just jump in? And what I discovered is really not many people do that. A lot of people come to the faith the same way that my Mormon family, my dad's wife's a Mormon. I've got 6 brothers and sisters raised in the LDS church, and they would say that they would give you their testimony. They believe that they've had an experience that came from God that changed their lives, and they've got wonderful testimonies, none of which are true, in the sense that Mormonism is not true. And so it goes to show you that you can have an experience that you could even claim came from God, yet not have a God experience, And so this is what's happening with this entire group. So that's why for me, that was never the way I was going to measure whether this was true, because I was surrounded by family members who believed something false on that basis. Yeah. I needed to know, is this evidentially true?
That's right.
And the rules of evidence will help you just not only discern what's true, but they'll protect you from error. When I became a Christian, I was, interested, and I bought a Bible. I wanted to see what was so smart about Jesus. I read through the Bible. I was struck by the fact that the stories don't align perfectly, and eyewitness accounts never align perfectly. So I thought, okay, this is worth testing now. There's a template for testing eyewitnesses. I simply applied that template. It's in the California jury instructions, but it's also, I'm sure, in the Illinois jury instructions, because every state in America has jury instructions to help jurors test eyewitnesses. So I simply used those jury instructions and applied them to the gospel authors. And guess what? They pass. Now here's what's interesting. At the same time I was doing that, my Mormon sister said, "Oh, you're interested in God?" And she sent Mormon missionaries to my house.
Oh.
So I spent 8 weeks doing the 8 steps of discipleship with Mormon missionaries. And I bought a quad, which is the Old and New Testament, Book of Mormon, Doctrines and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price. That's the entire set of Mormon scripture. I even bought, sitting behind me here, the Mormon church history from the LDS church. And I read through all of it. And I applied the same approach that I applied to the Gospels, that test for eyewitnesses. I applied it to the Book of Mormon. It fails miserably, and it fails quickly. And so, by the way, I would be more than happy if Mormonism was true, because I have a family that are Mormons waiting for me. The problem is it's not true, and it's demonstrably false. So that's why I say this approach to kind of walking in and testing something will lead you to what's true, but it'll also protect you from what's false. So I always say I became a Christian at the same time I became a not Mormon. And the reality of it is that it's the rules of evidence that really had a huge impact on me. Once you understand how to test eyewitnesses.
Okay.
It's a lot easier, not just with these documents. It's also easy when your kids come home and make a statement and you're wondering if they're true, if they're telling the truth. It's just the same approach you take with anybody. And I think what has to happen for most detectives are by nature suspicious.
Yeah.
Like people will call me all the time. My colleagues will call me all the time to run things by me. And what they're really saying is, I know why they're calling me. They're not calling me for good news. They're calling me to get that glass half empty view, right, of what's going on, because that's just my nature. Because that usually leads you to investigate deeper. So I had a glass half empty view of Christianity, and I just needed to work through that. And the rules of evidence helped me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was in the MA Apologetics program at Biola University, I took a class called Legal Evidence and Christian Apologetics. And so I kind of got to dip my little toe in this world of the courtroom, the rules of evidence. I found the whole thing fascinating. And also, just as an aside, my extended relatives run the family law firm, so it's kind of in my DNA as well. Shout out to Del Rosario Law in the Philippines. But in chapter 2 of your book, Jim, you talk about inference and using abductive reasoning to get to the best explanation for something. Give us an example of how you advise Christians to use this kind of approach in making our case as Christian case makers.
Well, some of these things we're looking at are not going to be made, or not going to be explained to people by way of kind of standard philosophical arguments like the cosmological argument, or those are great. I don't use them because I don't use them with jurors. I'm only looking for the approach I might use with 12 jurors in the box, because my whole career has been working with jurors. And I tell people all the time, I wrote about this in a book called Forensic Faith, where you don't win cases during the evidence show or during opening statements or during closing arguments. Sadly, you win cases at jury selection. It's what jurors are in the box and how do we talk to those jurors and how do we present evidence to those jurors. And one of the simplest things we'll talk about is this process of reasoning to the most reasonable inference, which we call abductive reasoning. And what it basically does is it takes two lists that begin with an E, a list of evidences and a list of explanations. And we're comparing the evidences in the room, the evidences in the crime scene, with the list of potential and possible, everything gets thrown in that list, explanations. And I don't hold back. You can write every possible explanation on that list. And then you look at those possible explanations and you compare them to the evidence and you determine which are not reasonable. And you cross them out until you're left with one most reasonable inference based on the evidence. And that really, we have to help jurors understand that's enough. That you're never trying to prove something in a court. This is why rules of evidence matter. Our standard of proof is not beyond a possible doubt. That's too high. I can't prove anything beyond a possible doubt. There are, as you know, there are reasonable, there are well-versed and well-established philosophers today who believe this entire universe is nothing more than a computer simulation. And they posit this in a way that's they're convinced of it. Now, I would say that's possible, but is it reasonable? The reasonable standard is a lower standard than possible. There's a gap between reasonable and possible. And in that gap probably lie most of your unanswered questions. So I tell jurors all the time, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know, but I cannot tell you everything that could be known because I don't even know everything. I've had cases where I know the guy killed his wife, but where did he put the body? Don't know. This is 30 years ago. I work cold cases. He buried her someplace. I don't know where he buried her. How did he kill her? I don't know. Well, how did he get the body out of the house? I don't know. Now, I still win those cases because I can explain to the jury that he did it, but I cannot always answer every question about how he did it. Well, this is true for all cases. That's a very simple rule. Now, abductive reasoning helps us because we're looking and saying, okay, so what's the difference between possible and reasonable, and how do we determine that? And a lot of that's how I became a believer in the resurrection. I looked at every possible explanation for the resurrection sightings, given what little I would have accepted as an atheist, because at the time I was not a believer. And I included about 6 or 7 explanations that I had either thought about myself or other atheists had posited. And I also included the Christian explanation. And I simply worked through those 7 explanations to see which is most reasonable, knowing full well that every explanation has strengths and weaknesses. Even the Christian explanation has strengths and weaknesses. And so I just did use that process. And I really think that there are more by the way, when atheists offer 6 different explanations for the resurrection, it ought to give you a tip. Because the reason why there are 6 is because none of them work. And if you hold to explanation number 4, you hold that explanation because you don't believe 1, 2, 3, 5, or 6 work. And this is true for everyone. And that's why you'll see all kinds of explanations offered, because everyone knows that they don't work. Now, there's one Christian explanation that does have a liability. It requires the resurrection occurred, and that's a supernatural act. So really what they have to do in order to examine this is determine whether or not our bias against the supernatural is warranted. If it is, then we can't accept it. If it isn't, well, then we might want to open our mind to it. And I think there are many good reasons to reject philosophical naturalism. I don't think it can explain many features of the world around us. And if there is a being that's strong enough to create everything from nothing, then that being can probably do those small potato miracles that are in the New Testament. And I just needed to be able to kind of let go of my bias against the supernatural. By the way, here in California, if you sell my house and someone dies in my house, you have to give that information, release that information to the next buyer. Did you know that? Why? Because people are freaked out by the potential for ghosts in their house. It turns out most of us believe in extranatural things. Like ghosts. Those are the most watched movies are paranormal activity movies, right?
Yeah.
Well, because we actually do have a sense there's something beyond the physical realm. Well, if there is, what if the thing beyond the physical realm is simply God and his created order, which is not physical? Well, wouldn't that explain some things? So I think this is why we have to at least be open to the possibility that you cannot lock down this kind of thinking, this inference against the resurrection as the Bible describes, because you have a bias against the supernatural. I do think that there's something that's caused the entire universe to leap into existence, whatever that cause is. Would be able then, the biggest miracle in Scripture is not in the New Testament, it's Genesis 1. Once you get past that, then I think the New Testament miracles open up to you.
Yeah, and the resurrection is the whole Christian faith rises and falls on that by the Bible's own standard. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says if Jesus didn't really rise in time and space for real, not in some metaphor, not in some vision, Christianity's false. You should do something else because you're still dead in your sins if you trust Jesus. And I'm a historical Jesus scholar, and so the first thing everyone needs to know when doing history is that we can only study surviving traces of past events. And so like you were saying, just because, this or that could have happened, we could have 10 different possibilities, but sure, anything's possible. You're not going to come to a jury with that. Well, but it could be that, well, sure, anything could be. But what's the evidence for this? What do these surviving traces of the past events tell us? And then what's the historical narrative that we can put together to make the best sense of those surviving traces of those past events?
When you say surviving traces, what are you really saying? Is this another way? Look, what historians and detectives do, cold case detectives at least, because my cases, I get them in a book. I don't get them. I don't get called out for those. I've had my share of call outs for fresh homicides, but I did that for 5 years. But then when I started working cold cases, now I'm looking at books that have supplemental reports written by detectives who are interviewing eyewitnesses. And now, because 30 years have gone by, 40 years have gone by, I don't have any access either to the eyewitness or to the report writer. Well, that's the Gospels. That's what we have. I have no access to Luke. And I have no access to who it was Luke was interviewing. I don't have any access to it. But now I can still use an approach I take in cold cases. Now, and the reason why I think that's helpful is because what I can do is I can introduce historical studies to a world that's largely interested in crime drama, true crime. So what I'm doing is trying to leverage that interest and here's what this is where I think we are right now. That I think it is going to be important for us in the next generation to help our kids see two things. Number one, is it true? Number two, is it good? We have to make both those cases. Is it true and is it good?
Yeah. And Jim, I really think you're right. For as many people, it might be that in older times, people would ask the question, is Christianity true first? And then wonder, is it good? Today, for a lot of people, that's reversed, where they want to know, is this even good before I even ask the question, is it true? they almost have to want it to be true first. God, that would be amazing if there was actually one day there could be perfect justice, but can I really believe that and be a reasonable person? And then some of these more traditional kinds of apologetics come in on the backside. And now they're going, I can believe this and still be a reasonable person. That we have to awaken that desire to see, the good and the true and the beautiful, that this actually can be real.
You're absolutely right. I just got done with a book that's coming out next May, which is called The Truth and True Crime. And what it really is a book that examines the goodness of Christianity based on biblical anthropology. In other words, it's got 15 attributes of human nature that you discover in crime scenes, in death scenes, that are really reflections of biblical claims about the nature of humans. And what you discover is that all of these features that modern sociologists now have determined are contributors to human flourishing, that are so critical for human flourishing. Well, they're all very ancient principles of Christianity that are now just kind of being rediscovered by modern sociologists, because if you're aiming at human flourishing, you'll hit a target that later on you will identify as Christianity every time. And so we want to be able to show, number one, it's another case for Christianity, but it's a case that I've not seen many people talk about, which is just the attributes of human nature that everyone who's a secularist right now would say, yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. I agree with that. Well, it turns out those are all biblical principles. They're very ancient. And there's another demonstration that the Bible describes the world the way it really is.
Yeah.
Including our human nature the way it really is. And if you want to know how to thrive as a human, you can do all you want. We've reimagined human thriving and human flourishing in the last 10 years. It's not a coincidence that as we move away from a cultural Christian worldview, we are moving into all kinds of increased drug use, increased mental illness, increase all the things that we're seeing right now. Well, no kidding. You're moving away from flourishing. So that's why it's important for us to be able to make a case. Is this true? Did the resurrection really occur? And that's why I wrote Cold Case, to show that, yes, that resurrection inference is the best inference from evidence.
Let me go back to something that you talked about in terms of direct evidence versus indirect evidence, because in Chapter 3, you talk about that. Give us an example of how that comes into play in doing apologetics. How does direct evidence and indirect evidence come to play in the way you make the case for Christianity?
If you understand the rules of evidence, there are only two categories of evidence, right? Those two categories. And why that's helpful is because everything, and I do mean everything, falls into those two categories. So when you make a case, like, what counts as evidence? Yeah, everything. What's in the crime scene counts as evidence. Okay, what's missing from the crime scene? That counts as evidence too. What did he say? What didn't he say? What did he fail to say? That counts. So both sides count. What did he do? What did he fail to do? Okay, it turns out every little thing he said counts, and every little thing he didn't say counts. It's just the nature of building cases in front of a jury. So everything in history that occurs a certain way, that's going to count. Everything that could have occurred but didn't, that's going to count too. And so when we look at the case for Christianity, it's really quite robust. And I think people will say, well, that doesn't count as evidence. Yes, it does. It does in every trial I've ever investigated. I think the problem is that people think if I don't have DNA or a fingerprint, I don't have any evidence. Well, look, I work cold cases. Guess what, folks? They're cold for a reason. They were lame to begin with. I've got no witnesses and no forensic evidence. That's why they went cold. Yet I've never lost a case, and we build them with all kinds of little things you would think are nothing, little bits and pieces of nothing that end up being so powerful because it's cumulative. So I always call this death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? It's a death by 1,000 paper cuts case. Now, any one of those paper cuts, you might think, well, I'm not even sure that counts as evidence. Yeah, it does. And when you put them all together, it's like, oh, now the inference is really clear. So I think that part of what we're doing here is helping people to see that yes, all the statements, and we test direct evidence, but all the indirect evidence also works, also is helpful for us when we're making a corroborative case. So look, there are 4 ways to test this. Was it early enough to have been written by people who were really there? The eyewitness has to be present. 2, can it be corroborated in some way? Remember, it's only touch point corroboration. You don't have a video, an old cold case. I don't have videos. That was not technology that was available back then. So I'm only going to be able to confirm fractions of the overall account. 3, did they change their story over time? And 4, do they have a bias that would cause them to lie to us? If you cannot disqualify a witness for one of those 4 reasons, the judge will tell you you're not allowed to disqualify the witness. It's as simple as that. Well, I don't like the way he looks. That's not one of those four things. I don't like the way his voice sounds. He reminds me of a guy I know who's a really good liar. Those don't count. Okay.
Objection, relevance.
Yes, it's gotta be one of those four things. And so I simply limited my investigation to those four things. And if you do that, you will see that the gospel authors pass those four tests in a way that Joseph Smith cannot in Mormonism.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's go to the gospel writers being motivated to lie. You talk about that in your book as well. I like that chapter. Can we trust the gospels? You said there are three reasons people are motivated to lie that you've uncovered. How did you investigate the witnesses, the gospels, with those three things in mind, and what'd you find?
There's only three motives. Now, these three motives stand on a platform like three award winners at the Olympics, right? The gold medal and the silver and the bronze. They're standing on a platform. The platform they're standing on is pride. So pride is the reason why all of us do anything stupid. If you needed one reason, it would be pride. But then that kind of fleshes out into three categories. And those three categories are behind every murder, and they're behind every theft, and they're behind every misdeed. Any misbehavior you've ever committed, it was only driven by one of these three. Every sin ever committed in the history of sins has only been driven by one of these three motives. Standing on that platform called pride is number one, financial greed. Two, sexual or relational lust. Three, the pursuit of power. Now, I would say that the first two are about 30% of all stupid. The last one, though, is probably about 70% of stupid. It's just an umbrella category that catches a lot of other stuff. So, for example, the pursuit of power is about my prideful thought that I am more important than you, and therefore I do things. So if I walk into a Walmart and kill 30 people who are a different color, what's that about? Well, that's the pursuit of power. That's me thinking my color matters more than somebody else's color. If I'm a gangster who shoots another gangster because he's disrespected me, what is that about? That's about authority and power and respect. And you disrespected me, you're going to die. What happens if somebody is stealing from his parents so he can support his drug addiction? Well, what is that about? It's about my addiction, my pleasure is more important than your inconvenience. These are power issues, right? And they manifest themselves in certain behaviors. It's about 70% of stupid. So if you look at those three, why they're helpful is because I often will hear people claim, well, if this is a lie, well, my question would be in front of a jury, why would he lie? Trust me, the defense is going to ask that. Well, my guy would never. Why would he lie? Well, I've got to be able to demonstrate what's in it for him. Why would you lie? There's got to be something in it from a sex, money, or power issue. And I think the people who are in the know from a skeptical perspective, like a Bart Ehrman, his claim is that he also would agree. There's nothing in it from them for money. Nothing in the history of Christianity indicates anybody got rich off the scheme. And remember, we're not talking about one person. We're talking about 120 in the upper room in Acts 1, 500 listed by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. How many people are making this claim? What is in it for them? Why would they say they saw their risen Christ? Were they getting money out of it? Were they getting girlfriends out of it? Now, I think what Bart would say is they're getting power, authority, and respect. They were nobodies. Now they're somebodies. They saw the risen Christ. Okay, so if you test that, Paul wrote most of the New Testament. So Paul, you're thinking he's not getting anything out of it in terms of money. He's not getting anything out of it in terms of girlfriends. You think he's getting something out of it in terms of power? Like, what is he getting out of it? He was already in a position of authority and power and respect with a larger religious group. Now he's going to jump in with the smaller one and get beat up all over the world for the next 30 years, so he could hopefully someday be where he started. Why even step out? You were better off just staying where you were. So that motive issue is helpful for me. I never make motive my first line of investigation with a single suspect, because sadly, Mikhail, there are just crazy people who don't need a motive. But it's different when you have groups, because then you need everyone to be similarly wired, similarly crazy to do this. It's much more unreasonable than when you only have one suspect. One suspect, sadly, I will not be surprised by anything anymore. I've seen so many crazy things. And now when I work with officers and I hear the crazy things that officers experience right now in the country, it's like you think your experiences are crazy until you hear everybody else's experiences. But this is different. This is a group that has to be similarly motivated in order to tell the lie. to me, it's very, if someone asks me, Mikhail, is that possible? I always say yes, because anything is possible, but I always say quickly, but it's not reasonable. And the standard is not beyond a possible doubt. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's why I'm in. I think this passes beyond a reasonable doubt. Does Christianity pass beyond a possible doubt? Well, from what we can examine as limited humans, no. But that's not the standard, right? I mean, there's always going to be some question that could be leveled that I haven't thought about. Maybe it's something that, but that doesn't matter. That's a possible doubt. And judges tell juries they are to eliminate from their mind possible or imaginary doubts, because judges tell juries, I could level a possible or imaginary doubt against anything you believe. That's why you ought not consider them. Reasonable doubts are based on evidence.
Yeah.
So if someone says, but what if? Well, do you have any evidence for
that? Right.
If you don't, then it's a what if. That stays in the category of possible or imaginary. It doesn't fall into the category of reasonable.
Yeah. It's like what if in the world of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like, well, what if?
Right.
Yes. Well, sure. Let's just imagine and have fun with it. But what evidence do you have so I can actually take that seriously?
We actually tell jurors, we have a set of sequences of images for jurors where we talk about these are the questions we never want you to allow in the jury deliberation. And one of those is just the question, what if? No, it's got to be based on the evidence that's been presented to you. You cannot do what's called speculating. Speculation is a jury instruction how not to speculate. And that's why I think that those rules of evidence are super helpful when just coming into conclusions about all kinds of things that you might encounter in life, including the claims of Christianity.
Yeah. There's one objection in your book that stands out to me where it's the challenge goes something like, they just read their Jewish scriptures, the disciples did, to try and invent a story that makes sense out of Jesus' death, and voila, they came up with the resurrection. And I like how you mentioned that, because how would that even get into their minds? Right? Thinking about the cultural background, how would they even get into their minds? Some Jews, like the Sadducees, they didn't even believe in resurrection. Other Jews didn't think it could happen until the end of the age. It would never have even entered their minds. So beyond motive, like, would they even think about this?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I think that if you look at it realistically, you hear all the time that Jesus is all the dying and rising saviors of antiquity, of the pagan sources on this. So what we're suggesting is that a group of Jews writing and trying to convince other Jews who have been warned as Jews not to worship the gods of any other culture, that we're going to now cobble together a story about God using just the motifs and stories and mythologies of non-Jewish gods in order to convince a group of Jews who have been warned against such things. To me, I don't know where this is going. And it's clear from Scripture that was the desire of the gospel authors. That was the desire of the apostles. That was the desire of those who were moving forward and proclaiming the Christian faith. That the Jews were in there. That was a target group. Okay, so it's not as though, well, yeah, they never intended to convert Jews. Well, it just turns out that you're right. They had a story that was probably the least plausible influence story you could create for a Jewish audience. And the reason why they created that story is because they didn't create it at all. It just happened. And then we're stuck with the truth. We're stuck with what really is, even though it may not be the kind of story I would have cobbled together if I was just trying to convince you of something. And that's one of the things I think we can look at and say, well, yeah, that also speaks to the fact that if you wanted to create fiction, you could have created a much more persuasive fiction than the one that everyone claims is fiction now. It just might be that story isn't fiction at all. Yeah, right. And why would you put women as the first witnesses at the tomb when in that very culture, that would be suspect to them? As why put forth, the very witnesses who in the culture didn't count as much? And I think it's just amazing in God's sovereignty that the people whose voices were marginalized in the community, God used them to be the first ones to proclaim the resurrection. I mean, you hear all the time that Christianity has a low view of women, but you have to remember the context of the culture in which it was written. It has a quite high view of women, and especially considering that the first readers, before you can do anything with the Gospels, you have to be able to reach the first readers. You're not writing for a future culture that might emerge in 2,000 years. You are writing for the culture that has to start the entire movement. And that's why I think it's important to see that that's really how we have to measure the view of women. I'm one of those guys who doesn't think much about the principle of embarrassment. You hear this all the time. People will use it. What I've discovered is that there are really good liars. I can think of 2 or 3 of my cold case work right now that understand that principle of embarrassment and leverage it well in their own descriptions of lies. Like they'll always include some embarrassing view of themselves because they're trying to convince me this is the truth. So I'm never, but this idea that the authors would use women, that's different. That's not a principle of embarrassment. That is just, a bad choice if you're trying to tell a lie. So I think that is something worth examining.
Yeah, I remember once I was on a jury in Norwalk, actually, in LA County. Part of the case hinged on this guy went back into the house. Why? To change his belt. Why? Because his shoes got dirty. Why would he change his belt? That makes no sense. And yet until someone on the jury was like, no, this is my culture. And in our culture, you don't walk out of the house if your belt doesn't match your shoes. So this makes total sense. And so sometimes understanding those cultural scripts, those cultural backgrounds helps us determine, no, this actually is a really good corroborative piece of data.
That's a great point. You just made, you can make a historical claim clearer by using an analogy from a trial. And that is the kind of thing that we see in the history of Christian case making. Is you will see that evidence demands a verdict. All of these kind of references to criminal trials or to casework in order to make a kind of a case, and to get a lot of it's just based on the Greek word for making a defense, right? That really is the same kind of view that we would hold about making a defense for in front of a jury or in front of a king or in front of some prosecutor. And so this is the kind of thing that we do. So I think this has been helpful. And that's what I'm trying to pass on in this book, not just ideas about how the law might, how legal cases work, but actually experiences where I said, okay, that doesn't work. This does. So we're trying to find, parallels that are actually not just, imagination. They are from our actual casework.
Now, in the end of this book, something I really liked is you had an afterward section where you touch on 12 common questions that you always get asked, and you've spoken at hundreds of events all over the country and maybe even thousands. And what is the number one question that you always get asked at your presentations? What would you say that is?
Well, I think now it's shifted. It's about the goodness of Christianity. Why does Christianity make this claim, which seems so antithetical to this cultural claim, either about gender identity or sexuality or marriage or about abortion, whatever it may be? Those are the ones we're going to get a lot more of. And that's where I see the shift. In the past, it's almost always been some aspect of the problem of evil, like why, and it's always multifaceted. There's all kinds of different kinds of evil. There's moral evil. There's natural evil. There's the evil that people would claim God is actually part of in the pages of the Old Testament, those kinds of things. So that's how it used to be. But, from the limited, what I try to do with those 12 is to stay with the case for the reliability of the New Testament. So this book is really about this narrow claim. And those claims, what I see a lot is, number one, this rejection of supernatural. And that drives a lot of skepticism. The idea that the Gospels could not have been written early because they include predictions of things that actually came true, like the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Therefore, they would have to have been written after the destruction of the temple because no one could actually guess that right unless it already happened. Although there's no manuscript evidence to suggest that claim is true. In other words, it's not as though we have manuscripts that can demonstrate that. That's based on a presupposition against prophecy. Or the other one, which is that, these miracles could not have happened. They would have to wait until everyone who knows the truth is dead. Then you can write anything you want about Jesus and his miracles because there's no one to tell you you're a liar. And if you write these things early enough, within 20 to 30 to 40 years of the events, there would still be people who would know if he really fed 5,000, if he really did those things. So that's why you see a lot of skepticism based on a bias against the supernatural dates the Gospels much later than I think they ought to be dated. And if you think about it, really that late dating didn't occur. It's probably only about 250 years old in terms of scholarship that the most skepticism about early dating has occurred. So I think in the end, those are some of the ones I get the most of. Like, why would I believe this is really early? Why do I believe the gospel miracles actually occurred? That kind of thing. But aside from that, the larger ones are going to be about the goodness of Christianity or theism generally, and the problem of evil and how to, and that's always got different views, right? It could be any number of things, including current events that would cause somebody to think, well, and I can tell you, that's not unusual when you work as a detective, because every Christian victim's family is going to ask, why would God allow that to happen to my daughter? Why would God allow any of this to happen? So those are not conversations I haven't had before, but they're difficult conversations, and they're much more nuanced. I can ask the question in 10 seconds? It might take 15 minutes to even begin to cover some of the reasons why God might allow any act of evil.
Yeah.
And where I think some of these are just to be honest, these are not 1 minute answers.
That's right.
They're going to be a much more involved kind of an answer, which is why I think if you're somebody who's like you and I, we are authors and we are writers and we are podcasters, but we don't lead large ministries. It's hard because I'll get an email. I get a bunch of emails I wish I could spend time answering, but it's like, wow, I don't have the bandwidth to do it. So I think it's a challenge. And you try to create videos and do those things, which really you have some email in mind when you did the video, because you knew there's no way I could answer 20 emails, but I might be able to do something online. So,
right. That's reminding me actually of a video that you put out recently where you talk about how in your line of work, you take many, many days, even weeks to put together a case for a jury and present it to the jury. But since we live in this soundbite culture where the objections are a TikTok, they're a meme, they're just communicated very, very succinctly. How do you advise Christians to adapt to that kind of cultural moment that we're in, where we can give a crisp answer that can kind of blunt the force of that challenge?
Yeah, you have to be effective in shorter periods of time, if not for no other reason, because you cannot give those people 20 minutes. You're going to have to give them the most effective 60 seconds you can give them. And so here's what I would say to people. Do you have a clear answer for these objections in your own mind? Because the clearer the answer is in your own mind, the quicker it's going to come out in the shortest form. I think what happens is we haven't thought through these things. We could tell you why we think that the Lakers are going to be better next year and get past the playoff round they were in this year, because we've thought about that. And we've been watching the draft, and we know they re-signed a bunch of their players and they're going to be really good. They just needed to add one player. Well, look, we know that case so well that if you ask me the question, I can give you a 30-second answer. But when it comes to the resurrection, we haven't thought about it as deeply. And now suddenly I'm meandering around a 4-minute answer. So a lot of it's going to be, how well do we know the case ourselves before we ever open our mouth?
That's a really good point. I think some people are really hesitant to share their faith because they don't know their own faith that well. And so they're kind of afraid to talk about it. But the more confident you get, the more you learn, that confidence can come across as a quiet confidence where you're not rattled by these objections, and you can give a crisp answer that maybe doesn't give the whole story, but invites the person into another conversation where you can explore this further. So
yeah, because if in your own mind you've thought about this and you've already settled it completely and confidently, well, then you're going to be able to articulate that in a way that settles it completely and confidently. I think a lot of it is where we're not quite sure. That kind of comes out in our answer, rather than having quick confidence that gives you the more brief answer.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for being on the show today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate having me. By the way, I love your podcast, and I want to congratulate you for the fine work you're doing at Moody. I don't think anyone has skyrocketed as much as I've seen you in the last year. So congratulations to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Jim. And I want to thank you so much for joining us as we kicked off season 2 here of the Apologetics Guys show. If you haven't seen episode 1 of this podcast with Jim's very first appearance on the show, please do check that out. Again, it's episode 1. You can go back in our archives and check that out. I think you're really going to enjoy that episode as well. A couple of key things that I think came out of our conversation today. 1, apologetics can play a role in someone's journey to faith. And 2, you can actually use some of Jim's insights from the detective world to become a better Christian case maker. And that's actually the goal of this whole podcast, to help you better engage the culture, make the case, and defend the faith. Please do subscribe to this podcast so you won't miss an episode, and consider supporting the show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help podcasts like this one so more people can find out what we're doing here. You can also support the show by leaving a super thanks on YouTube. As always, I'm your apologetics guy, Dr. Mikel Del Rosario. I'll see you next time, and until then, keep the faith.